Wow, it's our great honor to have Avri. We work together on the DC Coalition of Schools of Internet Governance. We rub elbows at NCUC meetings, at large meetings, and she's one of the board members with ICANN. And so it's a pleasure again, Avri, to have you. And I'm not going to babble too much, and I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'll shut my video. And Mike, over to you.
Okay, thank you, and hello all. Happy to be here again. Going to talk a little bit about human rights, and so let me go to the next slide. Yes, so I'm basically going to talk about human rights, but in the context of ICANN and IETF. And I don't know if I'll get to the IETF. I don't want to talk too much. I want to make sure there's time for people to ask questions about the first parts, but we'll see where we get to. But you've got the material there, even if we don't get to it. So yes, as I said, there's a short section on human rights, then a little bit on ICANN, then a little bit on IETF and IRTF on work that's been done there on human rights. One thing I want to mention, and this is really for any of you that listened to David Souter's talk, where he mentioned sort of a dichotomy between people that look at the internet from the technology point of view and people that look at the internet from a human rights, people-centered point of view. And what I think a lot of us are trying to do, what I try to do here, is sort of take the internet as an existing infrastructure from a technological perspective and look at how we basically apply human rights within the context that exists, and as understanding that at the platform level and above, there's a whole different movement, but there's also a need for sort of looking at internet and as a technical entity and sort of look at how human rights interact with that, as opposed to just at the other level. So let me move into, first of all, just on human rights, the background. I'm sure you mostly all have this, certainly not going to go into deep levels. But when we're talking about human rights, you know, the first thing that comes to people's minds is the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the foundation for it all within the UN system and such. But it is aspirational. It is not binding on any of the members. Whereas there are many other elements, many other covenants and agreements, whether it's on all forms of racial discrimination, civil and political rights, covenant on economic, social, and cultural rights, elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, convention on the rights of persons with disability, that basically those are covenants and agreements that do have buy-in, that are commitments, that do impose obligations on governments. The obligations are always on governments, but those do impose obligations. There's the Human Rights Council, and basically looking into there, when you have these human rights, well, how do you apply them? What makes them applicable to the internet? What is the connection? And one of the things I try to draw is sort of from the various existing documents, where is the connection? So we have the Human Rights Council that affirmed the same rights that people have offline must also be protected online, particularly freedom of expression, applicable regardless of frontiers and through any media of one's choice. So in looking at that, we basically sort of see that even though they probably were not thinking of a future internet, you know, when they created the UDHR in 48, in 2012, it basically, you know, in case anybody was in doubt, many of us weren't in doubt, but in case anyone was in doubt that human rights are human rights wherever a human may be, it was basically made definite. The other other points that I like to touch on is in 2015, governments should promote the use of strong encryption and protect anonymous expression online. The extent to which that is done, these are not binding. These are expressions from special rapporteurs who are basically empowered to basically explain to us what the rules mean, what the human rights are, how they, affect day-to-day life. Private entities should ensure the greatest possible transparency in their policies, standards, and actions that implicate the freedom of expression and other fundamental rights. Private entities should also integrate commitments to freedom of expression into internal policy making, product engineering, business development, staff training, and other relevant internal processes. Now, this basically goes down one step further and sort of looks at the work that's being done and says, just because you're designing a product does not mean you shouldn't be respecting those human rights. Remembering it's governments that have obligations, and it's the rest of us, businesses, institutions, and perhaps even people, though that is said less explicitly, also have a need to commit ourselves to respecting those human rights in the things we do. Finally, we have two other things. We have the Tunis Agenda with its commitment to freedom to seek, receive, impart the use of information, in particular for creation and accumulation and dissemination of knowledge. And I'm not going to read the whole things here, but you have them. And basically, it's sort of once again, and then goes specifically into measures that need to be undertaken. That was in 2005, and that was sort of the key to much of the IGF that eventually ended up being created. And then there was the Net Mundial, which was a singular event. Unfortunately, it's never been repeated yet. It was a singular event where governments, institutions, people came together and basically declared, again, that universality as reflected in that basic, aspirational document. Again, affirming that the rights offline must also be protected online. So that is the basic sort of pull from the abstract statements in 48, which sort of started all of this, to where we find ourselves, where those of us that are involved in technology or involved in technopolicy need to look at what does it mean for us to respect those rights in what we do. And I really hope I don't end up talking too much, because I do have a tendency to do so. One personal note here. I've been working in this in one role or another since 2003. Before that, I was a pure technical and never really gave human rights in the technology I was working on much thought, to be honest. It was something that evolved in my perception later. And I think that we've come a long way since the early 2000s. We've certainly come a long way since, last century. And neither the IETF nor ICANN are where I would like them to be yet, what my aspirational view is for what we do. But I think both our organizations are making progress. And the rest of the slides that I have sort of look at that from what's being done, how, as I said. And this little quote there, whatever I say about ICANN is my view. Despite the fact that I quote their documents, despite the fact that I'm on the board, these are my personal views. They're not ICANN's views. They're not the ICANN's board's views. But you probably can expect that these are views I express even in those places. Oh, there's a little bouncing red dot too. You guys all see the little bouncing red dot when I move. I include at the front here just some of the acronyms that'll show up in the slides, so that, you've seen them at least once. I'll try to remember to spell them out, as it were, when I get to them. But if I don't, I've put them here. So in ICANN, when we start looking at, okay, how do we go about respecting human rights? How do we basically root that in our work? How do we find the place for saying, wait a second, this is a technical organization. This is an organization that does techno-policy, that makes policy about technical entities and doesn't make policy about the larger issues in the world. And basically everything with us needs to go back to our articles, which talks about global public interest being determined from time to time, and that those public interest determinations come from the bottom up of the community, which includes, you know, all the stakeholders that participate in ICANN, including users. And then from the bylaws, we have our mission, we have commitments and core values. Within those core values, there is one on respecting internationally recognized human rights as required by applicable law. It doesn't create, nor shall it be interpreted to create, any obligation on ICANN outside its mission or beyond obligations found in applicable law. The core value does not obligate ICANN to enforce its human rights obligations or the human rights obligations on other parties or against other parties. And what that is basically saying is that, you know, while we have to respect those rights and we have to do it within our mission, it's not for us to go out to others and be missionaries of human rights to try and enforce them in any way. We need to respect them within the work we do, within our mission and according to our goals and values, but we are not, you know, we are not a human rights organization that basically has as its mission human rights, but we do have an obligation to respect them. And these were set forth in the bylaws and were activated later by the framework of interpretation that I'll get to later. So within an ICANN context, we look at human rights as part of our global public interest obligations. They were set forth in our bylaws, and they, you know, would not have force or effect until a framework of interpretation on basically looking at those human rights and say, well, what exactly do those words mean in respect to ICANN? How are we supposed to understand them? That has now been completed. That is part of our bylaws. That is part of our foundation. That's part of what motivates the work. And it's part of what can be used when someone wants to appeal a decision that ICANN makes. The board in ICANN is required to take the global public interest into account in any of our decisions. And in fact, if you look at those decisions, they always include, why is this in public interest? How did you weigh all the various commitments and values to basically come to a position of deciding that? The ICANN board has developed a framework. For years, we tried to define what global public interest was, and eventually we came down to defining a framework that looked at the various pieces. It's a human rights bylaw is a fundamental piece of that framework. The framework is currently being tried by ICANN. It's being used in two of the ODPs. Oh, it's an acronym I don't think I put in my acronym, which is the operational process. No, operation development process. I should have written it down. I would have remembered the exact words. It's a process that goes on in the organization in ICANN org while the board is still considering a decision and trying to determine whether it makes sense, whether it all works, whether it is in the global public interest. And within those processes, human rights is one of the questions that is actually approached. Now, one of the things that's involved in that is this new framework is still pretty much experimental at the board level, but there is this hope that as it gets formalized and as more parts of the community realize that it is being used, they start to contribute the basic input that the board would use to make its global public interest determinations. So then started looking at what other things has ICANN done. You know, the work on the global public interest and the human rights bylaws is work that's in progress and moving forward. In 2018, there was a first human rights impact assessment done. This was an impact assessment not on the policymaking part, but on the ICANN org and its functionings, and focused on human rights, event planning, procurement, security operations. These are the things that one finds described in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, often known as RUGI. RUGI is not something that has been adopted by ICANN, but the reviewers that ICANN, the external reviewers that ICANN arranged for, used those RUGI principles as that, and came up with a statement that overall, this human rights impact assessment shows that ICANN org has well-managed processes and policies in place. But, oops, I keep having trouble getting my button on there. As with all things, first, let me just show this, and I'm not going to go through it. But in basically working on it, the slide is there for you to look at. This is basically just copied from the document itself. On the HRIA, looked at the priority issues, which were those that were the most severe, would have the most severe impact, and ICANN could do the most about, through those that ICANN had less effect on, those that had lower impact, and those in finally 3 where low impact and low influence by the ICANN organization, and just wanted that to be there so you could look at how that was applied. And the HRA came up with improvements that they recommended, enhancements of process to foster equal and fair treatment of staff, internal grievance mechanisms, management of human rights risks in the supply chain, and effective management of human rights considerations running the public meetings. And since then, there has been work done by the organization on all of these basic improvements, and through the years, and the yearly reports and stuff show what work is being done. So work continues on those, but the quote from Joran Marby sort of, is sort of the top line on how important they consider this. And I do see the work being done. A little bit on the framework of interpretation. So as I said at the beginning, despite the fact that the bylaws was included at the time of the transition, it did not go into effect until the framework of interpretation was created. It was published in 2018. It was approved in 2019. As soon as it was approved, it became a functional part of the bylaws. And the framework of interpretation, and I'm not going to go through it here, goes through word by word, line by line, phrase by phrase, on not only how, ICANN can act, but also what this means to the various supporting organizations, the SOs, what this means to the advisory committees, and how that work in terms of, for example, introducing it into supporting organization, operational frameworks and what have you, is still work underway as well as the work within ICANN as a whole. And here's just two of the examples. You know, the human rights bylaw needs to be balanced against other core values in the case where not all core values can be fully adhered to simultaneously. And as is the case even with, you know, the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it is recognized that all of the rights as a totality are important, just like in ICANN, all of the core values and commitments as a whole are important, but these do need to be balanced against each other because not all of them operate at the full level of relevance in every discussion, in everything. So it's basically, this is a going into how that statement. And that balance is a central component in the ongoing work for the global public interest. You know, and then it goes into supporting organizations to consider defining and incorporating rights in their respective policy development processes. Human rights implementation agreements should not consider particular human rights in isolation, since they're universal, indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated. And this can be seen. One of the opportunities, for example, that exist is whenever there's an issue report, which is one of the things that starts off a regular PDP, a policy development process, there is an opportunity for people to discuss the need for human rights implementation assessments in the work that's being done. The last piece of this that I'm going to talk about is an ongoing effort. It's sort of a self-chartered by one stakeholder group, I believe. I think the charter is open to others to sign on to, but there's a real issue in terms of how to charter this. But it is work that goes on. And in 2019, they put out a report sort of designing a human rights impact assessment for the ICANN PDP. It's not something that's in heavy use. I understand this group is still working and meeting, though I'm not part of it. But what they try to describe is how to do one. And I understand, and so far that is described in this paragraph that I cut out from their document. And, you know, basically, it's an approach that really works for when you look at, you know, what the work you are doing, taking that step back and say, how will this affect people's human rights? How does that work? How do we go forward with it in a way that respects those rights? And since ICANN is bottom-up driven, if the earlier in the process, the closer to the bottom where this analysis starts, the better chance it has that by the time decisions get to the board, they have a notion, they have a view, even though it may not be a consistent view, of what the various concerns for the public interest and for human rights are, so that then the balancing tests can be done. And, you know, if all things balance, the board is in a position of saying, yes, we do believe this meets the global public interest. Let me see, did I have more on this? Nope. Okay, now let me stop here. And I don't know to the extent that people want to discuss what I've said already, or whether people would want me to go and look at something that's a little different, that's the IETF, IRTF, but that's also time consuming and I don't want to take up all the time. And I see I've already used half of it. So.
Okay. Can you hear me, Avri?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so I'm just scrolling back during your slides, and Mulud,
tell me what slide you want.
Well, actually, it's just general, but
Okay.
let me go back. He asked a question: is internet access itself a human right, or is it an enabler to other human rights?
Right. Okay. You know, obviously, I did specifically cover that. it's an item of discussion. I happen to see it. I agree that it definitely enables, but I see it sort of somewhere in between. I have this notion, it's not one I've developed in a scholarly way, of basically the secondary human rights or derivative human rights. To put it in a non-ordinal way, is that human rights, if you look at them, basically the right to access can be found rooted in those other rights. So it not only enables those rights, which is very much the case, and it's what people are looking at when we're looking at the SDGs, how do we do sustainable development, which is largely human rights oriented, which is largely about a rights oriented, human centered network. How do we do that? And we do that in part by using the internet and using it as a distribution means. But beyond that, the right to access can be derived from those rights that have been defined, and have been committed to. So I guess I put it sort of between those two. It's not just an enabler. It isn't, strictly speaking, defined as a human right that countries have signed on to, but you certainly can see it derived. And in fact, the work of the rapporteurs, the work of the Human Rights Council, are indeed expressions of that derivation. And that's why I try to sort of walk through this and showing, here's the rights, here's people showing that rights online, and then it doesn't specifically get to it, but it does that obviously you need access. That's in the SDGs and so on. So yeah. I hope that answers it.
Let's see, Malud, did you have a follow-up before I turn to Nicole? I'm just looking to see if he's popping anything in. I think he's typing something right now. Just as he's typing that in, I recall a few years ago, the province of, in Canada, rather than states, we have provinces. The province of New Brunswick stated emphatically that everyone in the province, as a human right, would have high speed. And I know from a Canadian perspective, getting high speed to every Canadian is aspirational. I don't think it will ever happen in some locations of rural and tribal and far north. It's a nice concept, but I don't think high speed is going to happen. I'm going to turn over to Nicole. And Nicole, did you want to use your mic to dialogue?
Sure. Thanks much. I was watching the interview with Maria Risa and Christopher Wiley over the weekend. They both talked about, Risa talking about her incarcerations and the way in which her government has been making the decision to specifically target her. And Christopher was talking about, his whistleblowing piece. I just wanted to know if Avri had any thoughts around how, for those of us in the global south for which the internet is still very new, how does she suggest that we maneuver that space? Because even those, like for us in the Caribbean, our governments aren't as punitive just yet, even though it seems to be creeping in. How do you think that some of these watch groups, some of which are women's groups, tackle this new space called the internet from a human rights perspective?
It's funny, one word comes to my mind is persistence. But basically, personally, I don't consider myself as being at all good at knowing how to get governments to behave properly, knowing how to get governments to live up to the obligations they have made in signing all of these instruments that make up the sort of, universal bill of human rights. And so persistence in reminding them in advocacy, especially governments that aren't terribly democratic, and even those that are terribly democratic. don't necessarily, have a vehicle. So it is through what groups have been doing, which is persistent and advocacy. And I try to avoid the word capacity building and education when it comes to governments, because we've seen lately that they're very sensitive to the impression that anybody can raise their capacity or can educate them, because they are, after all, governments. But basically it's a persistence, and it's very much the various forms of advocacy. And I guess it's participating in global institutions, whether it's IGF, ICANN, the Mozilla Foundation, the what have you, that are taking institutional approaches to, because while the voice of some individuals does shine forward loud enough for governments to hear, by and large, it's working with institutions where we start to get. But I know that's really just a hand wavy, keep working at it, but I really can't think of anything more,
Okay. Great. Thank you, Nicole. I want to turn to Bill. Bill, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm wondering, since to the extent that access to information is among the human rights, to what extent, in your observation, does ICANN look at things like DNS abuse and say, well, access to information means access to the access to accurate information, to the information you were looking for? And is there something in place to look at, well, we've made this operational decision, is it going to make things better or worse on that front? Thank you.
Well, as I'm sure you know, Bill, better than I do, there's very little I could say about the whole accuracy issue, as it is very much in policy development space. But certainly there is the expectation of, compliance within ICANN, that there be accurate information. And I think there was a need for accurate information even before people put it in the context of freedom of information. As you also probably have seen and know, the whole issue of DNS abuse, its various meetings, its various ways of combat, is a pervasive issue under discussion in ICANN now, from the group that's been started in the board to the various groups that are coming together, and it's trying to figure out, indeed. So I'd say, how important is it? It's important. We take it seriously. ICANN takes it seriously, but the extent to which any particular definition of what that means, or any particular activity is in place to enforce accurate information, and people look at, how do you enforce accurate identity information? Because when you're talking about accurate information, you're saying, we want accurate identity information. Globally, how do you do that? I know various people are looking at that problem and sort of saying, okay, if we accept that we need to have accurate identifiers, are we like China that's not going to let people register unless we've seen their ID? To what extent can we go? ICANN has to look at it within its mission, and that prohibition against imposing its view on other parts of the world, but also, to what extent is it even possible on a global perspective to do this completely? Or, what is the tolerance level? What is the level that has to be reached? So I think it's very much an issue that is important, that there's a commitment to, but that there's not perhaps a full understanding of exactly how do we do this.
Bill, go ahead. Follow up.
Yeah, I was thinking of it more in the context of some of the work that the project on the internationalization of domain names is doing,
Right.
and
Okay.
where they're defining what symbols used in a domain name are
Okay.
confusing or can be used to direct somebody to a domain that isn't actually the one they wanted. It just looks sort of like it. Because my perception is that's the human rights aspects of that are not even on the radar of the IDN project. I may be doing them an injustice, but that certainly is how it looks from my perspective. Thank you.
Aren't you part of this project? But anyway,
Yeah.
I'm not happy with
and
it.
so it should be in their radar if you're there, and that's kind of what I meant by persistence. But and coming from the bottom up, and taking into account the fact that yes, those things should be brought in, but they got to be brought in by the bottom up. It's at certain levels, the GNSO can ask questions, the board can ask questions, but it really is the bottom up that has to put it there. I think, first of all, the fact of universal acceptance, a term like artificial intelligence that one sometimes scratches their head at, but but it exists, and it's what people understand, is in the service of human rights, is in the service of making sure. Now, as I also understand, and I'm not deep into that work, that's one of the reasons why, they've sort of made rules that one label, is one part of a domain name between the two dots can only be in one script. And therefore sort of limiting that ability to sneak multiple scripts in. Now, I know that issue then goes down a layer and sort of talks about, what characters are allowed, which aren't, and takes those into discussion. There are policy development processes, working groups that I do sit in. I must confess, I have not sat in on any of those IDN working groups. It's not an area where I have anything to contribute to when it comes to talking about the letters, the characters, the scripts themselves. So I don't know to what doubt, but I would think that if there was an issue where to do A or to do B could be discriminated on the basis of a human rights requirement, then that would come into the discussion. But I really, do not know the discussions that are going on. And to sort of say, well, why wasn't human rights considered when we were talking about character X? I couldn't say. But it is the participants, it is the bottom up that brings these things in.
Thank you.
Okay, Bill. So I understand if human rights, this is Glenn speaking, it becomes such a thorny issue, such as what Alfredo was saying in terms of misinformation, you just change your name, such as Facebook. Is that correct?
No, I mean, certainly everybody says it's a good business technology. I don't happen to be on the anti-Facebook pattern. I have my own, probably more benevolent views of Facebook and its problems and the scope and scale of how to handle them than many people do. So I'm probably a bad one to ask. I do think that Facebook needs to deal with the misinformation. I do believe it is trying. I have yet to see how successful they are. Perhaps it's because I've been in a lot of large projects and large scalable issues that basically, I tend to be, more benevolent and sort of saying, give them time, keep the pressure on, persevere in pushing at them, but to condemn them the way we've condemned them when, we use them as much as we do, I'm not sure. But that really, is just me. And the fact that as a Facebook user, I've never seen any of this information because I told them I don't want to see it. I told them, I subscribe to what I want. So I sometimes wonder about what people are looking for. Yes, if you happen to say, I love this dictator and I am going to say like on this dictator, then that, and they've got to deal with that. But we can also educate users and ourselves and say, if you don't want to hear about that stuff, don't say you like it.
Right. My attempt to a bad sense of humor was the name switch with Facebook. But apart from that, you are an intelligent end user, and you should be able to discern what is truth and what is misinformation, and you have to take some responsibility. It's like going to a bar. You can decide when to stop drinking and or just get drunk. It really is personal responsibility. I just want to read what Alfredo has said. He's citing Bill. I'm assuming for the universal acceptance and the IDN, that's Internationalized Domain Names Initiatives, a lot of linguistic experts are involved. And I believe Bill is involved with the Latin script. Is that correct, Bill?
Yes, it is.
And so I understand the commitment. I think there's been a lot of discussion on universal acceptance with ICANN and their commitment. So we're seeing courses being offered. Lacrello did a series of courses. And others. So perhaps, Bill, you can talk about the universal acceptance course that Norello is doing, or
The Norello course is still a very much a work in progress, but the focus at the moment is on how to get the message out to people who are creating web browsers and email systems, that being able to deal with scripts beyond the Latin script is something they need to do. We're not looking, at least in the Norello effort at this point, at how do you go about doing this. It's still very much a matter of why you should do it rather than how you actually can do it once you've decided you want to. Thank you.
okay. Avri, you want to say anything on universal acceptance and the ICANN initiatives at all?
Other than what I just said, that I consider it one of our more important efforts, and a very difficult effort, because the institutions that need to adopt it and need to do work and need to spend capital to support it is so much broader than us. We have to make sure it works. But beyond that, I really laud the people in the group that are working together, that are putting together programs, that are going from company to company, major provider, sort of trying to convince them to do it, and are really serving the needs of also the technologists on, well, what do you do? How do you do it? What are the right things? So from what I see them doing, I think it's an incredibly laudable effort. I really hope it succeeds, but it's not something that I've spent a lot of, my time or bandwidth on, other than to say it is the greatest thing anytime someone asks me, because I really do believe in it from a policy perspective.
Bill, you were going to say something?
No, I'm sorry. I pulled hand.
Okay, so fundamentally, if anyone's interested in the universal acceptance training, this is a generic site I just posted in the chat. The as information comes down the tubes in terms of the actual, we have the actual dates for the Norello training on universal acceptance, but there'll be a lot of training coming through each of the ICANN communities, the SOs and ACs. So we look forward to that. So I just want to turn to Alfredo. Alfredo, did you have any comments?
Well, yeah, Avri, I actually see that there's a lot of fronts when we talk about human rights and bringing in the universal acceptance and IDNs, the internationalized domain names, into the picture. So I'm just wondering if it's possible to have those that are working on the theory speak to those that need to implement it, which will be the service providers and other groups together, so that we have a, well, I see you have a slide there of focusing precisely on that. So I'll let you talk more about that. Thank you.
Yeah, this is not, obviously, with 11 minutes left, I'm not going to get very deep into it, but this is the other side of the coin. I started with ICANN because ICANN and its policies seem to be of primary interest, but this is the work that's being done in the Internet Engineering Task Force, and especially in the Internet Research Task Force. And basically what's being looked at in the Research Task Force is this whole notion of making decisions when you are coding. This is basically going down to that next level that I alluded to before about, well, do the human rights people talk to the engineers? What should the engineers do with that? When you go up to an engineer and say, you got to pay attention to human rights, the engineer's going to go, I know about bandwidth, I know about speed, I know about power, I know about, I don't understand how I apply human rights. And also, it's one of the things that when we looked at it, this was in the IRTF Human Rights Protocol Considerations work, which is what's described in the rest of these slides that I hope people take a look at later. But basically, and this was a group, you had the you had the film bit of on Niels. And Niels and I and a third person were the ones that started this. We've drifted apart since then, but we were in the same place at one point in time. And basically what we tried to do is sort of, when you're doing engineering trade-offs, which is for the engineers among you, you know that every decision you make about how you're going to code, what kind of algorithm you're going to use, what kind of procedures and process you're going to set up, you're doing engineering trade-offs. You're doing, time it takes to do it versus how useful it'll be, power used, heat given off, and you're making all kinds of trade-off decisions. Is this more efficient than that? Will this use more computes? Etc. Is this algorithm more elegant than another algorithm? What about having human rights be one of the considerations in that trade-off? So whether a protocol enables human rights, whether a protocol in some ways hinders human rights, is something we don't fully understand yet. And in fact, whether it's the protocol alone or the protocol and its implementation and its deployment and its policies that do that is another open question. But basically, when you're designing it, how do you focus it? How do you deal with those issues? What kinds of questions do you ask? And let me see if these slides I've got anything. So yeah, this is about the research group. So I recommend RFC 8280. It attempts to bridge the language of rights and protocol technologies. It basically did a research of all the RFCs, developed a hypothesis on the relationship between protocol elements and rights, suggested considerations. It's being used in some protocols. It's certainly not a requirement in the engineering task force, but there are people that are using this as a tool for analysis. Just quickly. So when you look at that, these are some of the questions. Did you add a function at the edges? Or is your protocol fully documented? You know, have you considered privacy considerations? I could talk about these for a long time. And then there's more of them. Is your protocol design? So these are a set of questions. Nothing required, nothing mandatory, but basically, did you think about this? Did you think about that? Oh, if this is a problem in this area, is there something else you can do? Basically, in that whole notion of trade-offs of protocol design and implementation, did you think about these things? How much more quickly can I squeeze in? So, oh yeah. So then there's a map. So when you say, so this is just an example. When a human rights person comes up and says freedom of expression, using those definitions from 8280, and they're constantly being refined. Oh, they're talking about connectivity and privacy and security and content agnosticism and internationalization and censorship resistance and open standards and heterogeneity. Then there's basically an unpacking of that term in language that is more understood by a protocol designer. Likewise, you know, freedom of assembly and association, connectivity, decentralization, censorship resistance, pseudonymity, anonymity, security, that basically when they're talking about that, that unpacks into these elements. And those are just examples. 8280 is full of them. So, and then currently, for anybody that's really interested, these are topics that the Human Rights Protocol Considerations Group is actually talking about now, and they've got ongoing. And I recommend anybody that's interested in this topic at the technical level, at the what can you do about it when you're designing a protocol, get involved with you know, the HRPC group and join it. As I say, I was co-chair for I was a founder and co-chair for over 5 years. I recently stepped down because I just found I didn't have the time to put into it that a co-chair needed to do. Plus, I had some quibbles about the work we were doing because I've come to believe that implementation and deployment are as important, and we got to consider those. So I fell out of line with the mainstream of the work, but the mainstream of the work is still really good. And you know, if anybody's interested in that level of consideration of how do you design it, this is a really good place to go and hang out.
So thank you. Charles asked quickly, he's quite inspired by the last few slides you just did, and he wants to join the group. Any recommendations how Charles can participate?
Yeah, you subscribe to the list. Let me see. Did I put in the information? I will get you. I will. While you're doing your last minute thing, I will get you the.
You go ahead and let me thank everybody for attending today. I wanted to turn to Alfredo to say any last comments about the course. As we're going to have 2 more speakers. We have Han, and then we have our last session on Mitchell will be speaking with her panel on artificial intelligence for emerging technology. Alfredo, any comments regarding the final survey or anything else on the course?
Yeah, sure. I do want to remind everyone that we're getting close to the end of this cohort of this group of participants. If you're seeking the certificate of completion, please, please, please complete all the quizzes, and remember that you can take them as many times as you need to reach the 80% performance in each one. Also, you have to mark the participant guidebook as mark as done below the title of it. At the end of the course, there's a more extensive survey that we want to get your feedback on. So please look into that. And after that, immediately you submit that survey, you will get your certificate. It'll be automatically generated for each and every one of you. I don't want to leave uh, and give the word back to Glenn before saying, Avri, thank you so much. The presentation is so good. I could actually, I think everybody could spend another hour just asking you some questions and hearing some of the aspects that you didn't have an opportunity to touch on. So we're looking forward to have you in a future group so that you can give it a little twist, and we can probably dive into more aspects of human rights and the different organizations around the world that deal with it. So thank you, and Glenn, we're back to you.
Great, thank you, Alfredo. You said a lot of what I was going to say because I think you've just whet our appetite on this, and I hope we did justice to this topic with the supplementary material and the material in our course, and the human rights elements intertwine all through the course, like it's everywhere. So it's not just dedicated to this section. Remember, we have 11 modules, but they flow into each other, and sometimes it's a bit challenging. Asking people to speak on a topic because they touch on so many things. And this is such an in-depth topic, which is great. And it's a real pleasure to have you as always, Avri. And it's nice to see you outside of the ICANN sphere. I know we were stuck together in the last couple of weeks, but we're taking a breather, and it's a pleasure having your company. And folks, thank you again. This concludes the call today, and we'll see you all next Monday.
Bye all. Thank you very much for listening to me and asking questions.
Thank you. All the best, everyone.